Applying Catholic Teaching on Migration. And we have as moderator Reverend Vicentius Doe. My apologies. We have Todd Scribner. And Todd Scribner is the Assistant Director of Education and Outreach at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, Department of Migration and Refugee Services. There, he works on the intersection between migration policy, U.S. history, and Catholic ethics, manages partnerships and research projects with major institutions, including the University of Notre Dame, the Catholic University of America, and Princeton University, and oversees the development and distribution of policy and pastoral resources for church-related initiatives. Let's all welcome Todd Scribner.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. I assure you I'm just a warm-up act here. We have Kristin Heyer, who's actually going to give the talk on Catholic social teaching and migration, but Mario and the Center for Migration Studies has been warm enough to give me a few minutes to talk a little bit about what we do. First of all, I want to thank the Center for Migration Studies for all the work that they did preparing this event and their staff. They did all the hard lifting. You know, I joined them for a few calls here and there to help plan it, but we really owe them all the credit for what we have here today. So thank you. And I also want to thank St. John's University here. And I know that Father Shanley had to leave, the president, but I actually have a story about him that I think will be more than a personal confession and will actually relate to the work that you all do, at least indirectly, but I think more directly than not. Back in the day, years ago, when I was an undergrad at the Catholic University of America, Father Shanley was my philosophy professor, who I had several courses with over the course of my 4 years at the university. After I graduated, I went to Boston College. I was looking to get a PhD in philosophy. And I realized after the first semester that philosophy was not what I wanted to do. A little too abstract, too much Hegel, Kierkegaard was a little too much. I needed something a little bit more concrete in my life. And so I actually called Father Shanley up. And we had a series of discussions like, what do I do with my life? I just don't know what to do. I thought I wanted to get a PhD in philosophy and teach, but that's not working out the way I wanted it to. And so he suggested, after a series of conversations, we'll look at something like church history or religious studies. Maybe you can get a PhD in that, because I still wanted to pursue higher education. And so I thought about it for a while, and I looked into it, and I actually went back to the Catholic University of America and got a PhD in religious studies, sort of a cross-disciplinary with church history. And then from there, when I was working on my dissertation, a position opened up at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. I took that, boom, boom, boom. Here I am speaking to you at St. John's University, where Father Shanley is the president. Now, this isn't, as I said, a personal confession as such. It has a bigger meaning. And that is, he had no idea. We lost touch around 2001, 2002. He has no idea what the trajectory of my life was, before I talked to him, just a few hours ago in the hallway here. But the conversations that he had with me had an impact on the course of my life. It sort of led me to where I am today. And it's very important to recognize that. And in the world of migration, we can get very easily caught up and lost in the numbers, the millions of people who are here in unauthorized status, the 200,000 people that came here to the region over the past 2 years, the thousands of people that cross the border at any given time seeking asylum, the number of people who cross the Mediterranean looking for a better life, it goes on and on and on and on. But what I urge you to do, and I hope you do, and I hope I'm not telling you something that you already know, what I urge you to do is recognize that the engagement you have with the individual person on a day-to-day basis has an impact. It may be a one-off thing, it may be something more medium term or longer term, but don't get lost in the big picture numbers. Recognize that what you do with the individual people you're engaging matters. It has an impact. And you may not know what that impact is this side of heaven, in the same way that Father Shanley did not know what his impact on my life was, but you have an impact. So when you go back to your churches, you go back to your organizations, kind of refocus on the individual persons that you're helping and realize that matters. Now to some of the more dry stuff. As I said, I work for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, Migration and Refugee Services, and we do a lot of stuff. We're one of the biggest resettlement agencies in the world. We work with Catholic charities all across the country who make that happen. We work with Children's Services. We have a Children's Services office that engages, unaccompanied migrant children, unaccompanied migrant refugees who have sort of lost their families, who've been detached from their families, family separation. We help them. My job there is in the education field. And the way I see it is I'm kind of a conduit to the local level, or that's ideally what I do, to provide resources and to develop initiatives that will help people on the local level, Catholics, to kind of understand what the church is doing and understand why the church is doing it, right? And so we help to hopefully, effectively help you better understand what's happening in the policy world. Working with our policy office, kind of translate that to language that's just sort of simple and not really legalistic and complicated. We also try to provide teaching on sort of the connection between Catholic social teaching and migration generally, the why behind it. Why do we do what we do? What are the scriptural foundations? What are the foundations in Catholic social teaching that sort of give rise to the work and the reason why we do it? And there's an emphasis really on parishes and schools and local organizations that are Catholic in particular, that we're really trying to focus on. And that's one of the reasons why I was so excited to work with Mario and the Center for Migration Studies on an event like this, because it's bringing together people from parishes and organizations on the local level who we're really trying to reach on a day-to-day basis. And one of the ways that we do that is what's called our Justice for Immigrants campaign, which was a campaign that was established about 20 years ago, initially in the pursuit of immigration reform, but which has expanded since then to cover a wide array of issues on migration, refugee resettlement and unaccompanied children and asylum and that sort of stuff. But it's really effective only with the work of the people on the local level, sort of as a grassroots mobilization and also as an education campaign. I won't explain too much more about that right there, but what I would really urge you to do, there's a sign-up sheet on that table over there. If you're not part of the listserv, I would urge you to put your name and put your email address on there. We will send you, I promise, not bajillions of emails on a daily basis. It'll be an email every couple of weeks generally, and if something really significant happens, maybe something a little bit more frequently, but just so you can keep up to date as to what's going on in the policy world, and also, what kind of resources and initiatives we're doing that may help you to better understand why the church does what it does. On that note, I will stop. And I will invite Kristin Heyer up to give a talk on Catholic social teaching and migration. I won't read her biography. It's in the, it's in the handouts that you got. But the one thing I will say about her is that she's a consultant for the Committee on Migration, and she's fantastic. She's really one of the best consultants we've had that I've worked with, and we've worked with a lot of really good ones. But she's always there. She comes to these events. She's kind of responsive, and I think you'll have an opportunity to learn a lot today. So thank you very much, and come on up, Kristin.
Todd. I think she's responsive is something else. I think that's better than the bio. Just she's responsive as somebody who chased down emails as well. It's a pleasure to work with you, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you here today. I'd like to thank Mario for the invitation, I'd like to thank Nirka and Jeff for your support today, wherever you are, in pulling off this presentation and your hospitality. I'd like to thank the inspiring morning panelists and really all of you for your relentless work on behalf of migrants, asylum seekers here in New York City, and welcoming someone from Red Sox Nation down to be with you all today here in New York. Is the mic okay? It worked. So your own work here in New York immerses you in the signs of the times facing immigrants. And so I thought I would supplement the webinar you all had last week and this morning's reflections with some of my own on how Catholic sensibilities shape the Church's migration ethic. And by way of background, as I was telling table 23 in the back, my own work teaching theology and ethics over the last 20 years at 3 Catholic universities, now at Boston College, but on the West Coast before that, in Los Angeles at Loyola Marymount, up at Santa Clara University, and a lot of work in Ambos Nogales at the Kino Border Initiative has shaped my own thinking on this, accompanying now undocumented college students at 3 universities and work at the border. So my current campus, Boston College, hosted this replica of the magnificent Angels Unawares sculpture the year after the original was installed in St. Peter's Square. And I think this traveling replica came through New York next after Boston, so I'm hoping this is a familiar image. I know it landed near Catholic UNDC permanently. Featuring immigrants from across time and locations forging ahead on a common ship, it evoked for me Pope Francis's first trip outside Rome in Lampedusa. You might recall he celebrated Mass there, which had become a safe haven for migrants seeking refuge going from North Africa to Europe. Prior to making any public statement, he blessed and tossed a wreath of flowers into the sea, commemorating the then 20,000 African immigrants who had died over the previous 25 years trying to reach new life in Europe. He then celebrated Mass there within the graveyard of wrecks, where fishing boats carrying asylum seekers end up after they drift ashore. Other reminders that Lampedusa is synonymous with dangerous attempts to reach Europe abounded. The altar was built over a small boat, the lectern and chalice carved from the wood of shipwrecks. And he lamented there in his homily our indifference to the plight of these vulnerable brothers and sisters, and he prayed for the grace to weep over our anesthesia of heart. In his recent encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis again draws attention to these broader forces impacting so many on the move today. He expands the migration question to address the impact of populist discourse, neoliberal economics, and virulent individualism. And I think this scope offers a welcome reorientation to discussions that too often just focus on border crossers' rights or states' rights alone, much like his attentiveness to sinful indifference on Lampedusa. He echoed this in very strong terms just 2 weeks ago in an audience. So these broader emphases reveal how barriers to reception are not just limited to questions of border fortification or refugee policy, but they include pervasive tendencies toward isolationism and harmful ideologies. Recent years have witnessed a rise in native populism fueled in part by the anxieties provoked by globalization. And as you know, here in the US, these trends continue to play out via an opportunistic politics of exclusion. But I think it's it's not just on the debate that we saw this week. Sometimes we encounter this in our churches, in our families. And so I wonder how Catholic imagination might clarify our vision amid these seductions of extremism and polarization. How we might bridge these internalized borders that divide us. Because here our immigration debates have long been framed by narratives emphasizing security threats and social costs, despite rhetoric about liberty and hospitality. At the same time, as you well know, regular studies indicate higher rates of immigration correlate with lower rates of property and violent crime. The rule of law rightly occupies a privileged place here in the United States, and yet a lack of accountability that marks Border Patrol procedures and a lack of due process afforded immigrant detainees belie this rationale. Even as we continue to hear rhetoric about migrant crime surges, migrants regularly flee homes with high numbers of homicides per capita, where criminal organizations terrorize with impunity, with rampant repression, corruption. And so the threat driving many such migrants is precisely the breakdown of rule of law at home. A second populist script casts newcomers as economic threats, and we see this perception historically fueled during times of economic downturn. Beyond studies that show immigrant laborers provide a net benefit to the U.S. economy and help increase jobs, the detention industry profits from irregular migrants, further confounding this economic threat frame. The multi-billion-dollar transnational immigrant industrial complex raises serious questions about the financial stakes in a broken immigration system, not to mention diminished oversight, public accountability. Estimates suggest Trump's mass deportation plan would cost at least $500 billion to implement, with annual losses of $126 billion in taxes and a reduction in the GDP of $5 trillion over 10 years. Finally, third, tapping into anti-immigrant sentiment provokes the demonization of racial, ethnic, and religious minorities. Representations of the outsider as a social menace signal the function of racism and xenophobia in our national imagination. Portrayals of immigrants as public charges or a dangerously porous border have long shaped our collective self-understanding. And this election cycle, we've heard Republican nominee Donald Trump refer to migrants as subhuman animals, poisoning the blood of our country. As Bishop Mark Seitz of El Paso warns, by contrast, the border wall is a monument to hate that merges nationalistic vanities with racial projects. Hence, fear-mongering scripts that mislead, consolidate power, but I think they make people more susceptible to a crisis management approach to immigration. So these diversionary tactics generally ignore structural relationships impacting migration, reducing migration to questions of border crossers in the Mediterranean or in the southwestern desert, eclipses transnational actors from view, much less blame. It refuses to consider those responsible for push factors like violent conflict, economic instability, or climate change. Moreover, I think fear of difference is pretty easy to mass market, and it shapes our imagination in powerful ways. As you well know, actual encounters with reluctant or desperate migrants, something you face every day, and evocative artwork like the Angels Unawares can help, I think, unmask these operative narratives. Catholic social teaching offers us a contrasting vision marked by human dignity, regardless of citizenship status, and a solidarity that crosses borders. I'm struck, starting with human dignity, by Saul's comment this morning I'm a someone, not a something. I'm a beloved son of God. There's a way in which that summarizes maybe my next 6 pages beautifully. Drawing on traditions of biblical hospitality, social doctrine, and human rights, Catholic migration ethics focuses on the plight and agency of migrants and then our relative duties of reception. The story of the Jewish and Christian pilgrim communities is one of migration, diaspora, and the call to live accordingly. Indeed, after the commandment to worship only one God, no moral imperative is repeated more frequently in the human scriptures than the command to care for the stranger. Despite convenient amnesia here in our own nation of immigrants, it was Israel's own bitter experience of displacement that grounded its ethic of just compassion toward outsiders. So you shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. When Joseph, Mary, and Jesus flee to Egypt, the emigre Holy Family becomes the archetype for every refugee family. And Jesus' praxis of hospitality to outsiders really recurs throughout the gospel texts. One of the most persistently recurrent themes in Scripture is justice and compassion for the vulnerable. The prophets repeatedly connect bringing justice for the poor to experiencing God. Concern for the economically vulnerable echoes throughout the New Testament. We can think particularly of the Gospel of Luke, which depicts Jesus being born in a stable among mere shepherds, and as inaugurating his public ministry in terms of a mission to bring good news to the poor, to release the oppressed. New Testament scholar Donald Senior notes that, quote, in the overall landscape of the gospel stories, the rich and the powerful are often in place, reclining at table, calculating their harvest, standing comfortably in front of the sanctuary, or seated on the judgment seat, passing judgment over the crimes of others. The poor, on the other hand, in the Gospels are often mobile and rootless. The sick coming from the four corners of the compass, seeking healing. The crowds desperate to hear Jesus roaming, lost and hungry. The leper crouched outside the door. Senior suggests that experiences of people on the move reveal a profound dimension of all human experience, and they challenge false ideologies of unlimited resources or unconditional national sovereignty that really choke our spiritual capacity today. So whereas the scriptures do not give us detailed solutions to contemporary policy questions on migration, for people who do turn to the scriptures about what kind of people to become, it's clear they should show a deep concern for marginalized persons. Biblical justice, which demands active concern for the vulnerable and prophetic critique of structures of injustice, challenges approaches to immigration driven by market or security concerns alone. So flowing from its scriptural optical nerve, its scriptural vision, the Catholic social tradition champions robust rights for immigrants in its documents, its outreach, and its advocacy, the work of all of you. So Catholic immigration directives are rooted not only in biblical injunctions to welcome the stranger, but also in longstanding social teachings on universal human rights, an understanding of the political community as oriented to serving the common good, and a global rather than a nationalistic perspective. Catholic social teaching is grounded in a vision of the person as inherently sacred and made for community. We're made in the image of God, therefore worthy of dignity and respect. Whereas this vision does not compromise autonomy, it also understands us as profoundly interdependent. So human rights are claims to goods necessary for us each to participate with dignity in common life. Catholic principles of economic and migration ethics protect not only civil and political rights, but more robust social and economic and cultural rights and responsibilities. So these establish persons' rights not to migrate, her right to fulfill her human rights in her country of origin, or to migrate if she can't support herself or her family there in their homeland. And so in situations where individuals face pervasive gang violence or desperate poverty, the Catholic tradition supports the right to freedom of movement so that people can live free from credible fears of violence, free from severe need. I would add that this vision of the person is not fundamentally at odds with our national narrative at its best. As former Network Lobby head Sister Simone Campbell put it on one of their Nuns on the Bus tours, she said, "Fear is crippling us and promoting an unpatriotic lie of individualism. After all, the Constitution begins, we the people, not we who got here first, we the owners of businesses, or even we the citizens." She worried we would lose our democracy if we couldn't return to living in community. So while the tradition recognizes the right of sovereign nations to control their borders, the right is not understood to be absolute. In the case of blatant human rights violations, the right to state sovereignty is relativized by the tradition's primary commitment to human dignity, to being a someone and not a something. Hence, its doctrinal body of migration teaching protects the right to remain and the right to migrate. And as you well know, this gets lived out in modes of charity and justice alike. Pictured here, Ruben Garcia, who's directed the Annunciation House in El Paso for the past 40 years, and whose advocacy has recently faced attacks, as you know. This was taken in March at an event with Jorge and Kevin and maybe some others in the room at the El Paso Juarez border. And advocacy, this is a photo the last time a bipartisan bill was pending, actually only to be dashed by the marathon bombing in Boston, where I live, which took us back to the 9/11 framework of risks of terrorists. Advocacy can serve not only to protect and empower, but I think to bridge the divide between often treacherous migrant realities. We talked about trauma this morning, and the pristine halls of Capitol buildings that can feel quite removed from that. I brought the sole of a shoe from Green Valley, Arizona, from the desert to the Senate office buildings. 20 years ago, in their joint pastoral letter, Strangers No Longer, Together on the Journey of Hope, the U.S. and Mexican bishops delineated these principles and called for nations to address the root causes of and legal avenues to migration, to safeguard family unity. And really overall, by contrast, over the past 20 plus years, deportation, border enforcement, and deportation by attrition have remained the primary focus. I see this was included in the supplemental readings for today, so I'm sure everybody has read it, Maria. In sharp contrast to dominant discourse, sovereignty and hospitality are understood in the Catholic tradition to be mutually implicating. So legitimate sovereignty has to be exercised relative to the universal destination of created goods and the basic conditions of justice. I think this is important. In addition to Catholic teachings on migration or economic rights, the tradition's commitment to the universal destination of created goods, this idea that the goods of the earth are intended for everyone, really ground its migration ethic. Pope Francis, I think, often underscores this social understanding of what belongs to people in need in light of constraints on market freedom. So once people do immigrate, the Catholic tradition profoundly critiques patterns wherein stable receiving countries like our own accept the labor of millions without offering legal protections. So Lucia shared some of these examples this morning on our sheets. Such shadow societies risk the creation of a permanent underclass, harming, I think, both human dignity and the common good. From Pope Leo XIII's 1891 warnings against employers' exploitation, through Pope Francis's condemnations of harmful global economic practices, the protection of human dignity has remained this bedrock principle, the central criterion of economic justice. It makes clear every economic decision, every institution, every business practice should be judged in light of whether it protects or undermines human dignity. St. John Paul II condemned the exploitation of migrant workers in particular, based on this idea that capital should be at the service of labor, not labor at the service of capital, mitigating against, we heard, wage theft or underpayment. He's pictured here touring an Italian chemical plant, speaking with workers who manufactured soda in 1982. That's one of my favorite labor pictures. I think this idea that the economy should serve the person rather than the other way around raises serious concerns not only about the freedom of markets compared to people, but about the significant financial stakes in our broken immigration system. Because detained immigrants fill beds and deportations fill private buses. So the Catholic tradition provides a counter-narrative of economic ethics, critiquing global dynamics that allow capital and goods and information to flow freely across borders, but not laborers. Pope Francis has been outspoken about the dictatorship of faceless economies, and I think his images of humans as commodities in a throwaway culture particularly resonates with vulnerable migrants' experiences. Lucia mentioned the food sector today. The Southern Poverty Law Center did a study where they interviewed undocumented women across the food industry, and respondents overwhelmingly reported feeling like they are seen by their employers as disposable workers with no lasting value, to be squeezed of every last drop of sweat and labor before being cast aside. St. Oscar Romero's poetic homilies, I think, often elaborated the tradition's understanding of human work as intelligent and free. Just quote one of them here. How beautiful will be the day when all the baptized understand that their work, their job, is a priestly work. That just as I celebrate Mass at this altar, so each carpenter celebrates Mass at his workbench. Each doctor with the scalpel, the market woman at her stand, is performing a priestly office. How many cab drivers I know listen to this message there in their cabs? You are a priest at the wheel, my friend. If you work with honesty, consecrating that taxi of yours to God, bearing a message of peace and love to the passengers who ride in your cab. I was thinking of this morning with the comments about restoring the dignity of the skills people bring across borders, even if a lack of work permits or documentations changes their plans. So the Catholic tradition explicitly protects the human rights of undocumented migrants in host countries in light of these very long-standing teachings on workers' rights, which do not depend on citizenship status. With so many undocumented immigrants having lived in our country for over a decade, I think a double society increasingly threatens the common good, one visible with rights and one invisible without rights. Obstructing viable paths to legalization for the majority of immigrants who we welcome in the marketplace, but not the voting booth or most college campuses or the stable workplace, risks making permanent this underclass of disenfranchised persons. Again, I think undermining not only Catholic commitments, but considerable civic values and interests. So ultimately, an approach rooted in human rights must both reduce the need to migrate in terms of forced migration and protect those who find themselves compelled to do so. I didn't wear a watch. I'm just sneaking a look across there, 12:04. I have a few more slides, but I know it's almost lunch. Are you with me? Can I keep going? Okay. Okay. It's a text-heavy slide. That's not how not to teach. But I have a lot to say. Okay, the tradition's defense of these rights. I just want to put the human rights tradition in a social context. Because I think one of Pope Francis's key contributions is to expand the migration question beyond rights violations, which is important, to asking all of us to consider how we're wrapped up, right, in indifference, in problematic social structures that really push and pull migrants, like he likes to say, pawns on a chessboard across borders. So I think his recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti does this in the 4 ways that I've mentioned here. He talks a lot about the social vision of the person, how we survive and thrive only through encounter with others, and how remembering this or retrieving this can counteract the individualism, the isolation, the indifference that harm people on the move. Conditions that perpetuate family separation undermine this social vision and harm the common good. And I think the social vision also is at the heart of his critique of exploitative economic models or aggressive modes of international relations. So structural analyses suggest that migration policy needs to consider receiving countries like ours complicity, economic, political complicity in generating migrant flows rather than just conveniently scapegoat. Established communities and migrants are often bound together by history, politics, and economics, even before the act of migration bridges the distance of geography. So employer recruitment tends to be shaped by prior bonds forged by colonialism, military invasions, economic ties. The ongoing legacy of 19th and 20th century US foreign policy and economic strategies, along with their attendant narratives, has generated flows from Latin America to the United States, for example. Given such systemic culpability, some have proposed an instability tax be levied on private and government entities that destabilize migrant-producing regions, refugee-producing regions, whether hedge funds profiting from commodity trading in African minerals, or weapons manufacturers profiting from selling arms to the Middle East, or multinationals profiting from degrading or destabilizing poor nations. So the story doesn't begin when a migrant shows up in Queens, right? We need to look back further historically and structurally at our complicity. My colleague at Georgetown, David Hollenbach, suggests that countries that have gained economically from their colonies or that have histories of military involvement in another nation have special obligations to folks who flee from that nation. So I think of that particularly for those of us working in refugee resettlement. So becoming a neighbor to the migrant through this social vision of the person, through a social vision of the good, demands meeting basic responsibilities and justice, not extending charity or hospitality alone. A social anthropology with robust rights and responsibilities then, I think, can recontextualize migrants in spite of pretty strong tendencies to locate responsibility just with a migrant choosing somehow in isolation to cross borders, choosing to work without documents. The Catholic category of structural sin helps us connect these relationships with harmful consequences. So structural sin, unjust structures, harmful ideologies shape the complex dynamics that both perpetuate inequalities and also harden our hearts or decrease our receptivity to the they, them who were mentioned this morning. So whether in terms of cultural superiority or profiteering, social inducements to personal sin in the immigration context abound. For example, Bishop Seitz explicitly decries white supremacy, xenophobia, and the deadly function of the southern border wall. He calls it an open wound through our cities and a monument to hate in his pastoral letter, Night Will Be No More. So this concept of structural sin links unjust institutions with harmful attitudes or ideologies. We could think of powerful narratives casting immigrants as security threats or takers, then influences individuals' roles in collective actions, like votes they cast in an election this November. Because these various levels of social sin interact in complex ways, right? We're not always aware of what we listen to on talk radio, commute after commute after commute, infiltrating our way of thinking or our vision. Pervasive cultures make us susceptible to myths. Operative understandings then go on to influence our action or our inaction. Pope Francis warns that our economy of exclusion kills and often challenges this ethos, this reductive market ethos, not only in terms of how it shapes policy, but in terms of its desensitizing effects on us. Fratelli Tutti repeatedly underscores other threats to our social instincts as well, how self-absorption can fuel apathy and hardened insulation or group preservation. Francis reflects there on the many ways we are tempted, like the priest and the Levite in the parable of the Good Samaritan, to pass at a safe distance so we can retreat inwards, remaining indifferent to others' plight. He elaborates how a culture of consumerist comfort, abetted by social media distractions, can manipulate consciences and really insulate us from others' perspectives. Think about your curated news sources or social media feeds. I watched the Social Dilemma documentary on Netflix a few years back. I don't know if anybody has seen this, but that's, I think, a good example of what he's getting at, this eerie window into how surveillance capitalism and social media really manipulate us in complex ways. So again, even though migration ethics typically focuses on economics or politics, sins like racism or a sense of invulnerability really facilitate our temptation to exclude. Returning to Lampedusa, Pope Francis lamented there the pervasive idolatry that facilitates migrants' deaths and robs us of the ability to weep, a theme that he revisited in Manila and then Juarez, insisting that only eyes cleansed by tears can see clearly. So I think this concept of structural sin is helpful for critiquing histories of unjust relationships, proxy wars, as well as harmful ideologies like meritocracy and xenophobia. And that if we just look at the immigration issue through a lens of individual wrongdoing, we really obscure all these complex multi-level dynamics at play. 12, 13. I would just like to say a quick word about women, and then I'll conclude. Because I imagine many of you work with migrant women here in New York City, and as unaccompanied women undertake journeys in increasing number, compared to when I started working on this 20 years ago, now about half of migrants worldwide are female, in some export-producing labor countries, much more than that. And yet they face unique threats. Sexual assault by smugglers and officials, harassment on the job, manipulation in detention facilities. They're less likely to qualify for employment-based immigration than men, And so the majority work in unregulated jobs in the informal sector. I think Lucia also mentioned domestic labor this morning at the Day Labor Center. Undocumented women are often perceived by predators as perfect victims of assault because they often remain isolated or uninformed about their rights and are often presumed to lack credibility. So beyond well-founded fears that reporting abuses will risk job loss and family separation via deportation, such women often also face lack of access to legal resources or language barriers or cultural pressures. Many remain indebted to their coyotes, their smugglers, and because they understand immigration officials often collaborate with law enforcement, they rarely seek help from the latter. They often cite family reunification as their primary motive for migrating. And so in the aftermath of deportation or detention, mixed status families face major instability, with children suffering poor health and behavioral outcomes. Trump's planned mass deportation would leave 4.5 million children partially or completely orphaned. So despite immigrants' courage and resilience, many of these patterns obscure their full humanity, as we heard this morning, as spouses, as parents, as children. Families comprise our most intimate relationships, and so policies that undermine family unity really frustrate this core relationality. So I just want to add Catholic family ethics to migration ethics and economic ethics and structural sin, because deprivation of dignified labor opportunities or traumatic enforcement mechanisms impede immigrants' families' access to social goods. I think these two threaten family values. I guess I would just add my time with women at Casa Nazaret, at Nazareth House in Nogales, always reminded me that migrants' decisions are not personal choices alone, that the social context is really important. The current director of KBI, Joanna Williams, recently put it this way: parents traveling with their children or sending them to cross the border alone are neither heroic martyrs nor conniving opportunists. So I think despite the loud political rhetoric, women's and men's decisions often cast as abandoning their children, right, or working without documents. These all happen within constrained social contexts. And ignoring those really highlights the inadequacy of our individualistic paradigm, those three lenses I started with. So just to conclude, for the 107th World Day of Migrants, Pope Francis adopted the theme towards an ever wider we. Given his approach to pastoral and social concerns, I think a dynamically more inclusive community provides an apt symbol for his migration ethic. In that message, he traced the history of our common origin and destiny, highlighting how we are redeemed as a people, not as individuals, that all might be one. He links this social salvation history to the present time in which that we, willed by God, has become wounded and fragmented. Quote, our we, both in the wider world and in the church, is crumbling and cracking due to myopic and aggressive forms of nationalism and radical individualism. Leo Guardado has a great piece about this in which the Spanish word nosotros is made up of nos and otros, us and others, in this image of we. Francis's papacy has witnessed an intensification in global migration, both in the number of displaced people and in the issue's increased politicization. We've seen from him unprecedented teaching on this, preaching on this, frequent pastoral visits to borders, to detention facilities, and he always repeats they are our brothers and sisters. Migrants are precious in the eyes of God. I am also always struck that he grounds his concern in scriptural texts. Some are familiar. I mean, we always hear about Matthew 25 or the Exodus. Am I running short on time? I'm sorry. Okay, I don't have time for what always strikes me, to stick to the text. But he also uses fresh ideas, like Jonah and the Ninevites. We can talk at lunch. Okay. Mario already mentioned the 4 central verbs of Pope Francis. That will save me some time. The afternoon, you're going to conjugate those verbs in terms of what that means here on the ground in New York. And perhaps just to close by returning to that Angels Unawares sculpture. The piece was commissioned by Cardinal Michael Czerny, the prefect of the dicastery that Pope Francis has started. He's also done a lot institutionally. And it was sculpted by Timothy Schmaltz. It features Muslims escaping Syria alongside Jews escaping Nazi Germany, an Irish boy escaping the potato famine. I think one could easily be an Eritrean heading for Lampedusa. And when I took my undergraduate students to visit it, they recognized their family histories in the sculpture. They recognized their very identities. And I think, like art, our religious practices, our narratives, our symbols, they hold the potential to reshape our moral imagination. This Pope has called attention to that task, to affect, to scripture. But my hope is that your work on the ground and our traditions help in reshaping a harmful lens and reshaping our imagination can help us move toward an ever wider we. Thank you.
That was amazing. That was actually great. I know there are a lot of questions, but maybe you can ask those questions during the lunchtime. I will allow one question, so you won't cry. There is a gentleman right here. Yes.
The question is, what's your take on the Pope's recent comment? It's from his general audience on August 28th. I thought that question might come up, Kevin. In case people are unfamiliar, just a few weeks ago in his general audience, Pope Francis said, "It must be said clearly, there are those who work systematically and with every means possible to repel migrants. And this, when done with awareness and responsibility, is a grave sin." Is that what you're referring to? What are the odds I'd be speaking publicly right after this unexpected comment? I think, so there was a lot of pushback, maybe you read in the news, a lot of outrage about this. I don't think I share the outrage, including from moral theologians, parsing what do you have to have a grave sin, grave matter, consent of the will. I think this is of a piece with Pope Francis over a decade, drawing our attention not just to migration as one other social issue or one of the social ministries of the church, like there are many committees at the USCCB. I think Pope Francis has been trying to say this is a death-dealing, avoidable situation. The fortification of our borders, the decisions by policymakers, the apathy of people narcissistically obsessed with their Instagram feed, like this is all contributing to avoidable death-dealing journeys. And so I think framing it in those terms as a life issue, if you will, as an issue of life and death, and with the caveats that he gives of awareness and responsibility, I don't think it's inappropriate to raise the stakes in terms of sin language. You can see from my overly long slide, I prefer structural sin when it comes to migration. But I think the universal church and local churches have a history of lifting up particular social issues, of prioritizing particular issues, including in elections. And I wonder if this isn't helpful amid the dehumanizing rhetoric, the dehumanizing trends, and the death-dealing policies and inaction that have unfolded during his papacy. I don't know if this is being recorded, but that's what I think.